It was the summer of 1991 in a small industrial town in northern Illinois, the kind of place where factory whistles still marked the hours and everyone knew the names of the officers who patrolled their streets. Among them was Inspector Harold Hal Denton, a 43-year-old veteran of the local police force. To most, Hal was what a cop was supposed to be: steady, calm, fair. He'd been with the department for almost 2 decades, and over the years he'd become the quiet backbone of the unit. But in the weeks leading up to that summer, something about him had changed. His wife, Ellen, would later tell investigators that Hal had grown distant, not angry, not depressed, just distracted. Like his mind was someplace else entirely. That final Friday night began like any other. The department's old brick station sat just off Main Street, glowing in the orange streetlight haze. Inside, the late shift was winding down. Officers joked in the hallways. Paperwork piled up, and the coffee pot in the break room hissed its last drops. Hal had been in his office most of the night, poring over case files that no one else wanted to touch. At 11:40 p.m., he packed his bag, hung his jacket over his shoulder, and told the night sergeant he'd see him Monday. The sergeant nodded, nothing unusual. The next time anyone saw Hal was on the precinct security footage. At 11:47 p.m., he walked out the side door alone, carrying his keys, badge clipped to his shirt, his old leather duty belt slung neatly around his waist. The grainy black and white video caught a small moment just before he disappeared into the dark. He paused, looked back toward the station, then stepped off the curb and vanished from frame. It was the last image anyone would ever record of him alive. When Hal didn't come home that night, Ellen wasn't immediately alarmed. He'd worked long nights before. But when the sun came up and his car wasn't in the driveway, something felt wrong. She called the station around 8 a.m., expecting to hear he'd been held up on a case. Instead, the duty officer hesitated, said he'd check around, then promised to call her back. He never did. By noon, the department had quietly mobilized a small search. Officers drove his usual route home, checked nearby diners and gas stations. A few coworkers said maybe he'd gone up north to clear his head. Hal had been under serious stress. Only a week earlier, he'd taken over an internal review involving missing narcotics from the evidence locker, a case that had ruffled feathers inside the force. He told one colleague he thought someone in the department was behind it. Then, according to his notes, he stopped talking about it altogether. That afternoon, a patrol car found Hal's Chevrolet Caprice parked on the outskirts of town, near an abandoned rail yard that hadn't been active in years. The car was locked. His hat was on the passenger seat. His service weapon, a .38 revolver, was missing from its holster. The keys were gone, too. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no fingerprints. It was as if he had parked the car, stepped out, and disappeared into thin air. The search that followed was quiet but intense. Officers combed the overgrown rail yard, flashlights sweeping through weeds and rusted metal. They brought in dogs, divers, and even off-duty volunteers. Nothing. The scent trail stopped within 100 yards of the car. The ground was dry, undisturbed. Investigators began mapping out his final 24 hours, but every lead hit a dead end. His credit cards were untouched. His phone, a bulky department-issued car phone, was found in a trunk, battery dead. The department issued a public statement 2 days later. Inspector Harold Denton is missing. We are pursuing all leads. But inside the station, tension thickened. Rumors spread that Hal had been on the verge of turning over information to state investigators, evidence that pointed back at his own colleagues. Some whisper that he'd staged his disappearance out of fear. Others believed he'd been forced into silence. Still, no one dared to speak those words out loud. Detectives interviewed Ellen again that week. She said Hal hadn't mentioned names but told her one thing the night before he vanished. I think I'm close to something, but I don't know who to trust. When asked what he meant, she said he wouldn't explain. He just kissed her goodnight, told her to lock the doors, and went to bed early. By the 3rd week, the case shifted from urgent to uncertain. Without evidence of foul play, they couldn't call it a crime. Without evidence of a voluntary disappearance, they couldn't close it either. The file sat in limbo. A state investigator named Alan Whitaker reviewed the findings and noted something strange. Hal's car keys had never been recovered, but his spare set was missing from his home desk drawer. The implication was subtle, but chilling. Whoever parked that car might have had access to his personal keys. Over time, the official theory settled into something almost convenient, that Hal, overwhelmed by stress and guilt, had taken his own life somewhere remote. But there was no body, no note, no trace. Ellen refused to accept it. She put up flyers, contacted retired officers, even reached out to a local news station. Each attempt was quietly discouraged. One anchor admitted off record that the department asked them not to air her interview. By autumn, the town moved on. A new inspector took Hal's office. His nameplate was removed from the door, replaced with someone else's. But those who had known him, the ones who'd worked the same shift, shared the same locker room, said things never felt the same again. Some described a strange unease around the station at night, as if the building itself remembered something everyone else had agreed to forget. Then, in 1992, something unexpected happened. A farmer reported finding an old police holster half-buried near a drainage ditch, less than a mile from the rail yard. It was worn but still recognizable. Lab tests confirmed it was standard issue from their department, but no serial number tied it definitively to Hal. The discovery briefly reignited the case, but once again, the trail led nowhere. The file was sealed. Years passed, and Hal's disappearance faded into local legend, another small-town mystery buried under time and bureaucracy. But for Ellen, it never stopped haunting her. Every night she left the porch light on, convinced he'd somehow find his way home. And inside the department, the older officers learned not to bring up his name. Because every time they did, the conversation ended the same way, with silence. 14 years would pass before that silence finally cracked. In 2005, a young recruit cleaning out an old storage locker would stumble upon something that would drag the entire department, and its past, back into the light. Something that proved Hal Denton had never really left the station that night. And when that discovery came to the surface, it would unravel everything the town thought it knew about what happened after the clock struck 11:47 p.m. In the weeks that followed Hal Denton's disappearance, the department scrambled to make sense of what had happened. Detectives combed through his files, his home, his locker, even his desk drawers. On paper, it looked like the kind of investigation that should have produced answers. But the deeper they went, the less anyone seemed willing to talk. It wasn't just silence, it was fear disguised as routine. Officers who'd once shared late-night coffee with Hal suddenly claimed they barely knew him. Those who had worked alongside him for years now described him as distant, unpredictable, maybe even unstable in his final days. Behind closed doors, however, investigators discovered that Hal had been looking into something that could have easily gotten him killed. Months before he vanished, Hal had been assigned to review inconsistencies in the department's evidence log, specifically narcotics seized during routine drug arrests. At first, it looked like simple clerical errors, missing signatures, wrong dates, mislabeled bags. But Hal noticed a pattern. The same few officers kept signing out evidence after hours for testing or review, only for those drugs to never return. It wasn't just one mistake. It was systematic. And it led back to the property clerk's office. By early June 1991, Hal had quietly opened a secondary, off-the-record inquiry. He started keeping personal notes, storing photocopies of reports in his home office instead of the precinct's archives. Co-workers remembered him spending more time alone, locking his door when he worked late, and writing on small yellow notepads that never left his sight. He told one officer he was close to proving internal theft but didn't want to involve internal affairs until he had something solid. Those were his exact words, something solid. After his disappearance, detectives finally managed to locate some of those notes. Most were routine, timestamps, badge numbers, property receipts, but one entry stood out. It read simply, Locker 13, check Friday. The word locker was circled twice. There was no explanation, no context, just that single note buried among pages of routine observations. Investigators initially assumed it referred to a suspect's locker or a gym locker at the precinct. But Locker 13 didn't appear in any of the department's logs. Around that same time, detectives discovered another disturbing clue inside Hal's office. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of blank forms, they found a small spiral notebook that had been half-burned. The edges were blackened, the pages fused together by heat. It looked like someone had tried to destroy it but stopped halfway through. When analysts separated the sheets, they found names, partial lists of shift schedules, initials of officers, and in the corner, a single phrase scrawled in block letters, "They're watching me." When questioned, no one admitted to burning the notebook. The department blamed it on a cleaning mishap, a cigarette accident, anything but deliberate destruction. But those who saw it up close said it felt intentional, like someone had panicked. By late summer, the investigation into Hal's disappearance began to stall. Detectives tried to trace any phone calls he made during his final week, but his records had already been purged. Requests for state support were delayed or ignored. The narcotics review he'd been working on was quietly reassigned to another inspector, who closed it within 2 weeks, citing insufficient evidence. Then something even more unsettling happened. The small team of detectives assigned to Hal's case began receiving orders to move on to other investigations. The search funding was cut. Press updates stopped. And the internal review into the missing evidence, the one Hal had initiated, disappeared from the system entirely. One of the investigators later admitted off-record that the case didn't fade out. It was buried. Colleagues who'd known Hal personally began to sense that something wasn't right. Some said he'd grown paranoid in those final days, claiming he was being followed by someone in his own department. He had stopped driving the same route home, started taking side streets, even switched vehicles with a friend once to see if anyone noticed. But no one took him seriously. They thought it was stress. The same stress that now made his disappearance easier to dismiss. As months passed, the narrative began to shift. The official story evolved from missing officer to possible voluntary disappearance. Without a body, without signs of struggle, and with a growing sense of embarrassment over the unsolved case, higher-ups began floating theories that Hal had fled. They suggested he might have been involved in the very corruption he'd been investigating, that maybe he'd taken the evidence and vanished to avoid exposure. It didn't make sense, not to those who knew him. Hal had spent half his life cleaning up the department's mistakes, not running from them. But in the absence of answers, the rumors spread easily. By early 1993, the town that had once searched for him started to move on. News coverage stopped. His wife, Ellen, exhausted from 2 years of false hope, finally packed what was left of their life and moved out of state to live with her sister. She told neighbors she couldn't bear to see his empty chair at the kitchen table anymore. The department quietly erased his name from active files. His badge number was retired, but no ceremony followed. His photograph, once framed in the hallway among long-serving officers, was removed and placed in a file cabinet in the basement. It wasn't disrespect, not officially, but it felt like an attempt to rewrite memory to make it seem as if he had never been there at all. Within the force, whispers persisted that the disappearance had been handled internally. Some believed Hal stumbled onto something larger than a few missing drug bags, perhaps a full ring of theft and redistribution that reached beyond the station. Others believed he'd been framed, made to look unstable before being silenced. No one ever found proof. No one ever looked hard enough. By the end of 1993, Hal Denton's file was stamped presumed deceased. No foul play. No active investigation. Just another name lost in paperwork. The official report listed the cause of disappearance as unknown. Unofficially, the few who had cared enough to keep asking questions knew that wasn't the truth. The case hadn't gone cold on its own. It had been frozen from the inside. Years later, one retired detective would admit that even mentioning Hal's name inside the precinct made people uncomfortable. Not because they feared ghosts, but because they feared the living, the ones who still held their badges and their secrets. For the next decade, no one would speak of Hal Denton again. His house was sold, his files forgotten, and in the quiet corners of that old brick precinct, the word locker, the one he'd written down just days before he vanished, would remain meaningless. Until 14 years later, someone new opened the wrong door and found something that should never have been left behind. By 2005, the disappearance of Inspector Harold Denton was little more than a fading rumor. Most of the town's residents had either moved away or forgotten the details, and the police department that once searched for him had changed almost entirely. The building itself looked the same, cracked beige paint, humming fluorescent lights, but the faces inside were younger now, detached from the town's darker history. Among them was Officer Megan Halloran, a 26-year-old recruit barely a year into the job. She wasn't from Illinois. She'd transferred in from Indiana, eager to prove herself, unaware that the building she walked into each morning carried ghosts that had never left. It started as a simple assignment. The department was clearing out an old storage wing in the basement to make space for new equipment. The room had been sealed off for years, stacked with unclaimed evidence, broken lockers, and dusty file boxes no one wanted to deal with. Megan was asked to catalog what could be salvaged before the maintenance crew arrived. She didn't think much of it. She spent hours sorting through boxes labeled with half-erased names and decades-old case numbers. Most of it was junk, Old uniforms, cracked radios, even a typewriter. But in the far corner of the room, tucked behind a row of rusted filing cabinets, she found a small steel evidence locker that wasn't on any of the department's logs. The paint was bubbled and flaking, and a faded label on the front read, "Unprocessed. Do not remove." The lock had corroded, and someone years earlier had wrapped a strip of police tape around the handle. When she forced it open, a wave of stale air drifted out, the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. Inside were several unmarked envelopes and a few loose items. Most of the envelopes were blank, but one caught her attention immediately. It was brown, thick, and sealed with brittle tape. Written across the front in black ink were two words, Denton H. She didn't recognize the name at first. When she looked closer, she noticed the date in the corner, 1991. 14 years old. The envelope was heavier than the others. She carried it to her desk, peeled the tape away carefully, and slid out what was inside. It was a police duty belt. Old, cracked, and stiff with age. The leather was dark with what looked like old stains, mud, dust, something she couldn't quite place. The brass buckle had tarnished, and the nameplate riveted into the front read, faintly but unmistakably, H. Denton. She turned it over in her hands, confused. The tag inside the envelope listed no chain of custody, no officer initials, no date received, nothing. It was as if the belt had appeared out of nowhere. Megan brought it to her sergeant, expecting at least some explanation. But the moment he saw the nameplate, his expression changed. He told her to leave it on his desk and go back to the storage room. She could tell from his tone that she'd stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to. Within an hour, two men from Internal Affairs arrived. They didn't speak to her directly. They sealed the locker, collected every envelope, and told the property clerk that the items were being transferred for review. No paperwork, no acknowledgement. By the next morning, the locker was gone, welded shut and replaced with a blank steel cabinet. The following week, the department acted as if nothing had happened. But the silence made Megan uneasy. When she asked her sergeant what the item was, he told her not to mention it again. That was part of an old case she didn't need to worry about. That's when she finally looked up the name. Inspector Harold Denton. Missing since July 1991. Presumed dead. The official report said he'd left the station after a late shift and never came home. His car was found near an abandoned rail yard. No leads. No body. No foul play suspected. But what struck her most was how thin the file was. Barely 15 pages. For a missing officer, it felt almost deliberately incomplete. Over the next few days, Megan couldn't stop thinking about the belt. The way it was hidden, the way everyone reacted to it. She decided to dig deeper on her own time. Late at night, after her shifts, she stayed in the archive room reading through old logs. The department's internal records from the early 90s were stored on microfilm, faded and half erased, but she started piecing together fragments. She learned that Hal Denton had been investigating a corruption case involving missing narcotics from the evidence room, an investigation that mysteriously vanished from the system shortly before he did. She also discovered that nearly every detective originally assigned to his disappearance had retired within 2 years. A few had transferred to other precincts. One had died in a supposed car accident not long after the case was closed. None of them left statements. Megan's unease turned into suspicion. She went back to the evidence room and searched for the original property reports that should have documented the belt's chain of custody. There were none. The logs skipped from 1990 straight to 1993, as if the year Hal disappeared had been deleted. When she mentioned the gap to a clerk, he told her it was probably a data migration error. But when she pressed further, he lowered his voice and said quietly, "You don't want to ask questions about that one." That night, Megan printed out everything she'd found. She took photos of the archive pages, copies of the microfilm, and a note she'd scribbled in the corner of a document that listed old staff rosters. There it was again, a connection she couldn't ignore. The same names appeared both in Hal's investigation notes and in the narcotics scandal he'd been looking into before he vanished. Several of those names still worked at the department, promoted, respected, untouchable. She began to see a pattern. Every time the Denton case resurfaced, it disappeared again within days. Files vanished. Supervisors changed. Evidence misplaced. It wasn't incompetence, it was control. Megan didn't tell anyone what she'd found. Instead, she saved the photos she'd taken of the belt and the envelope onto a flash drive she kept hidden in her locker. She wrote down a timeline. July 1991, disappearance. 1993, case closed. 2005, the belt reappears. But one detail still haunted her. When she examined the photos closely, she noticed the belt wasn't just old. It was dirty, caked with dried material that looked like a mix of mud and dust. Not dust from storage, but soil. Someone had dug it up, cleaned it, then sealed it away again. Megan thought about turning the evidence over to the state police, but she didn't trust anyone above her chain of command. Every time she brought up Denton's name, conversations stopped. One older officer told her that Denton had been asking for trouble, that he'd gone too far digging into people's business. Another said he probably ran off and staged the whole thing. But their stories didn't line up. They contradicted each other at every turn, and yet all shared one strange consistency. None of them would admit to ever seeing him that last night. Weeks later, Megan returned to the basement storage area, but the entire section had been cleared. The walls were freshly painted. The old file cabinets were gone, and the small plaque on the door that once read Evidence Storage, Archive B, had been replaced with a new sign, Maintenance. Whatever she had found that day was gone, erased like it never existed. But Megan had the photos, and those photos would become her quiet obsession. She started looking up retired officers, digging into old personnel files, tracing where they'd gone after 1991. The deeper she went, the more she realized that Hal Denton's case wasn't a tragedy of one man disappearing. It was a symptom of something far bigger that had been rotting beneath the surface of the department for years. And although she didn't know it yet, the small discovery she'd made in that forgotten locker would become the first loose thread in a cover-up that had been sealed away for over a decade, one that would soon unravel in ways no one at the precinct was ready to face. In 2005, the whispers inside the precinct grew louder, but no one dared to speak above a murmur. Officer Megan Halloran couldn't let it go, the belt, the secrecy, the way Internal Affairs had swooped in overnight and buried what she found. She knew something about that locker room story didn't make sense. So she went back quietly to the source. The old custodians who'd worked through the early 90s were long retired, but one of them, an aging man named Ray Holbrook, still lived nearby. He remembered things others had chosen to forget. Over a cup of black coffee in his dimly lit kitchen, Ray told her about the basement renovation that took place in '95, how a section of the locker room had been sealed off after a leak supposedly contaminated the area. But he swore that wasn't the full story. He recalled that one night, officers came in after hours, carrying something wrapped in a tarp, and ordered him out of the building. By morning, that section of the locker room was locked and never opened again. The station called it a health code issue, but to Ray, it felt like a cover-up sealed behind concrete. Megan's gut twisted. If the belt had come from that room, it meant it hadn't been sitting quietly in storage for 14 years. It had been hidden intentionally. She requested access to renovation records, maintenance logs, anything related to the basement closure. Most files were missing or redacted. The few that remained were vague, biohazard remediation. Entry restricted. But she noticed something strange. The date on those documents was only 6 days after Inspector Hal Denton's disappearance. The coincidence was too much to ignore. A few days later, Megan received a quiet message from the State Forensic Lab. She had managed to convince one of the analysts off the record to run limited tests on the photos she'd taken and a sample swab from the belt surface that she'd collected before Internal Affairs confiscated it. The results chilled her. Microscopic traces of human tissue were embedded in the leather stitching, too small to extract full DNA, but undeniable. There was also a faint chemical residue consistent with a solvent used in the precinct janitorial supply line back in 1991, the kind used to sanitize large spills. It wasn't the kind of evidence that got there by accident. Someone had cleaned blood off that belt. That night, Megan sat in her car outside the station long after her shift ended, staring at the glowing windows of the building she thought she knew. For the first time, she felt afraid to walk inside. What if this wasn't just an old case? What if someone still inside the department knew exactly what happened to Hal Denton and had made sure it stayed buried? The more she thought about it, the more she saw the same names circling around every lead, the same sergeants, the same clerks, the same detectives who had handled the stolen narcotics scandal Hal had been investigating before he vanished. She reached out to one of them, a retired officer named Len Garrison, who had been working the night Hal disappeared. Len was in his 70s now, living alone on the outskirts of town. When she first called, he hung up. But after a week of silence, he called her back and told her to come by. No uniform, no badge. His house smelled of dust and cigarette smoke, the blinds drawn even in daylight. Len looked like a man who hadn't slept well in years. At first, he denied everything, claiming he barely remembered that night. But when Megan showed him the photos of the belt, his face drained of color. His hands trembled as he leaned back in his chair, mumbling, "They told us it was an accident, that he slipped." She pressed him for answers. Slowly, between deep breaths, the truth began to crack through. Len admitted that Hal had been pushing too hard into something that should have stayed internal. He said Hal had discovered that evidence, drugs, cash, confiscated items, was being skimmed and resold through officers inside the department. Hal had traced the corruption straight to a senior official, someone still revered in the town. That night in 1991, Hal confronted one of them in the locker room after hours. Len didn't see what happened, but he heard shouting, then silence. The next morning, Hal was gone. Within days, they were told to stay quiet. The case was reassigned. The files disappeared. Megan could feel her heart pounding as Len's voice broke under the weight of old guilt. He said he never saw Hal again, but everyone knew something bad had happened. He was onto something too big, Len whispered. After that night, people started transferring out. The ones who stayed learned fast. You move on or you move out. His eyes filled with tears as he said it. We thought it'd never come back up. The confession confirmed what Megan already feared. Hal Denton didn't just vanish. He was silenced. And the place where he was last seen, the basement locker room, was likely where it happened. Someone inside the department had cleaned up the scene, erased the evidence, and buried the truth behind a mold cover story. When Megan left Len's house, the sky was gray and heavy with rain. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, replaying everything in her head. 14 years of silence, one forgotten belt, and now the faint shape of a crime that had lived hidden beneath the very floors of their precinct. The deeper she dug, the more she understood. This wasn't just about one man who vanished. It was about a department that had quietly decided which truths were worth keeping. That night, she returned to the precinct and walked down the old stairwell to the basement, the air damp, the lights flickering. Behind a rusted door marked Storage B, the wall that once sealed the locker room still stood, cracked and uneven. For a long time, she stood there, feeling the chill of the concrete and the weight of the silence. Somewhere inside those walls was the truth. A truth someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. And now, with every step she took closer to it, Megan could feel eyes watching her, not from the past, but from within her own department. She didn't know it yet, but reopening Hal Denton's case would come at a price. Because the secrets that lived inside that locker room were not done claiming lives. Megan didn't sleep that night. She drove home in silence, headlights cutting through the rain as her mind replayed every word Len Garrison had said. The thought of it, that a man like Hal Denton, a decorated inspector who had given his entire career to the force, had died not out there on some dark road, but inside his own station, at the hands of the people he trusted, it ate at her. She kept picturing the belt, the cracked leather, the faint reddish stains embedded deep into its stitching. 14 years it had been hidden, quietly decaying beneath layers of dust and lies. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure that story stayed buried. By morning, Megan had made a decision. She would reopen the case, even if she had to do it alone. Officially, she couldn't. The department had already ruled Hal Denton presumed deceased back in 1993. His file was locked away, and any attempt to dig it up again would set off alarms she wasn't ready to face. So she started in the shadows. Nights after her shifts, she'd sit in the archive room surrounded by yellowed reports and cracked manila folders, looking for small, forgotten details. She began mapping out a timeline, dates, personnel, transfers. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Every officer connected to Hal's final investigation had either retired within a year or been reassigned to remote precincts far outside the county. The only one who'd stayed and climbed the ranks was a man named Captain William Carroll, now deputy chief. Back in 1991, Carroll had been Hal's superior and the last person to see him alive. The deeper Megan dug, the more the department seemed to close in around her. Her access to certain databases was suddenly restricted. She was told her enthusiasm for old cases was becoming a distraction. Then one night, she found her desk drawer unlocked, her notes scattered, her USB drive gone. That's when she realized this wasn't paranoia. Someone knew she was getting close, and someone wanted to scare her off before she reached the point of no return. She took a few days off under the guise of illness and drove 2 hours to visit Hal's widow, Margaret Denton, who had remarried and lived quietly under her new name. The woman was hesitant to talk at first. She'd spent over a decade trying to forget the pain. But when Megan told her about the belt, Margaret's composure broke. Her eyes filled with tears as she described Hal's final weeks. He'd been distant, distracted. He told her he was onto something but couldn't share the details, only that it involved people he'd worked with for years. The night he disappeared, he promised he'd be home before midnight. When he never arrived, Margaret said she knew instantly that something terrible had happened. But when she called the station, no one seemed alarmed. "They told me he probably went off on his own," she said, shaking her head. But I could hear it in their voices, the fear. They already knew. Margaret opened an old box she kept tucked away in her closet. Newspaper clippings, photos, a few of Hal's personal effects returned after his disappearance. Among them was a single note written in his handwriting, folded into a small envelope. It said only 3 words: "Locker. Don't trust." The message was hauntingly similar to the scribble found in Hal's burned notebook years earlier. For Megan, it was confirmation that Hal had known exactly where the danger lay, and who was behind it. He had left that word behind as a warning, or maybe as a map. The locker. The one sealed away beneath the station. The same place where his belt was found. Back at the precinct, Megan knew she couldn't approach internal affairs, not when the corruption seemed to reach that high. So she turned to a journalist she trusted, someone who'd covered police corruption cases before. His name was Ethan Drew, an investigative reporter for a local paper that had once tried to look into the Denton case before it mysteriously went cold. Megan shared what she had: the photos, the lab report, the retired officer's confession. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable, then said, "If what you're telling me is true, this isn't just about Denton. It's about the department's entire history." But before Ethan could publish anything, things began happening fast. His emails were flagged, his office received anonymous threats, and Megan was called into her captain's office without warning. She was told there had been complaints about her conduct, that she was creating distrust among fellow officers. They suspended her badge pending review. The timing wasn't coincidence. The message was clear: stop digging. For the next week, Megan stayed home, but her mind wouldn't rest. She replayed every connection, every name, every clue. The solvent on the belt, the tissue sample, the word locker, the sealed basement. Everything pointed back to that one room, the only place she hadn't been allowed to enter. So one night she went anyway. It was close to midnight when she parked behind the precinct and slipped in through the service entrance. The hallways were silent, the building nearly empty. Her flashlight beam cut across the peeling paint and old pipes as she descended the stairwell to the basement. The air grew heavy damp. She could smell the mildew long before she reached the old locker room. The wall that sealed it was still there, a patchwork of concrete and plaster, cracked along the edges. Megan's hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the surface. For a moment, she thought about turning back. But then she saw something glinting faintly in the beam of her flashlight, a small metal tag embedded in the wall. A number, almost rubbed smooth, 91-07. The same code that had appeared in Hal's old case files. It was enough to make her heart drop. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. If this wall had been built days after his disappearance, and if it carried a code tied to his investigation, then the truth wasn't metaphorical. It was literally sealed behind it. Suddenly, Megan heard footsteps echoing above her. Slow, deliberate. She froze. The sound grew louder, descending the stairs. Someone else was there. She turned off her flashlight and held her breath, pressing herself against the damp concrete. The steps stopped at the bottom. For a few seconds, there was only silence, then the faint metallic click of a flashlight being turned on. A voice called her name, low and steady. Officer Halloran. It was Captain Carroll. His tone wasn't angry. It was calm, almost sympathetic. "You shouldn't be down here." Megan's pulse hammered in her chest. Carroll's beam of light swept across the floor, landing on the sealed wall. "You found it," he said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take someone." He stepped closer, and in that moment, Megan understood everything. He didn't need to say it. The way he looked at the wall, the way his voice softened, It wasn't surprise, it was ownership. He'd been there that night. He knew what was behind that wall because he helped build it. Caro took a slow breath. "You're a good officer, Megan," he said. "Don't make the same mistake he did. Some things are better left buried." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading back up the stairwell. Megan stayed frozen for what felt like minutes, her whole body shaking. She didn't follow him. She didn't speak. She just stared at the cracked wall, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. When she finally made it back outside, dawn was just starting to break. The air was cold, sharp. She sat in her car, staring at the precinct through the windshield, and realized that the truth, the real truth, might never be something she could prove. The evidence was gone. The people responsible either retired or untouchable. But the belt had surfaced for a reason. Someone, somewhere, had wanted this story to come back up. And now it had found her. She turned the ignition and drove off into the pale light, the voice of Captain Caro echoing in her mind. Some things are better left buried. But she knew, once something like this surfaced, it never really stayed buried. By the fall of 2005, Megan Halloran's life had shifted from quiet duty to constant vigilance. Every night when she drove home from the precinct, she checked her mirrors, scanning for the same black sedan she swore she'd seen tailing her twice that week. Her phone calls sometimes cut out mid-sentence. Her mailbox was tampered with. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was pressure. The kind of pressure that comes when you start asking the questions no one wants answered. She had gone too far to stop. The belt, the wall, Captain Caro warning. It all pointed to something bigger than departmental negligence. Someone had cleaned up more than a crime. They cleaned history itself. But what happened that night in 1991? The pieces were scattered, brittle with age, but Megan could feel the shape of something under the surface. She just needed someone who'd been there to finally say it out loud. That confession came 2 weeks later from a man named Paul Rankin. A retired detective who had worked directly under Hal Denton back then, Rankin had moved to a small lakeside town and lived out his final years quietly. He'd refused all interviews for over a decade, but when Megan showed up on his doorstep, pale, exhausted, clutching a folder labeled Denton, something in his expression shifted. Maybe guilt had been gnawing at him for too long. Maybe he was just tired of carrying it. Inside his dimly lit home, surrounded by dust and silence, Rankin poured 2 glasses of whiskey and sat down heavily. It took him a long time to start talking, but once he did, the truth came out in fragments, halting and painful. That night, June 18, 1991, Hal had stayed late after his shift. He'd been investigating irregularities in the evidence logs. Narcotics listed as destroyed that never made it to the incinerator, seized cash that vanished before deposit. He traced the falsified entries to an officer named Thomas Reddick, a well-liked patrolman with ties to the property room clerk. Hal confronted him in the locker room, just after midnight. The argument turned violent. According to Rankin, who entered the room moments after the commotion started, Hal had Reddick pinned against the locker, shouting that he'd already turned over the files to internal affairs. But Reddick wasn't alone. 2 other officers were there, Caro among them. Rankin said there was yelling, the metallic crash of a locker door, and then a sound like a body hitting tile. When the shouting stopped, Hal wasn't moving. Blood pooled beneath his head. Panic spread instantly. They tried to revive him, but there was no pulse. Caro made the decision. He said they couldn't report it, not with the department already under state review for missing narcotics. If this comes out, he told them, we all go down. So they carried Hal's body out the back entrance, wrapped in a tarp, and drove him to a construction lot behind the precinct, a dirt patch slated to become a new parking area. They buried him beneath a mound of filled dirt and debris, promising to come back later and fix it. But they never did. Rankin's voice broke as he spoke. We thought he was dead, he said quietly. But I still don't know for sure. We didn't check long enough. Over the following week, the precinct fabricated a story. Hal had driven off after his shift and never come home. They staged his car near the rail yard, planted false leads, and destroyed the locker room logs. The belt, his signature black leather belt, had come off during the scuffle. It was left behind in Reddick's gym bag, forgotten amid the panic. When the locker room was sealed years later, during renovations, that duffel was accidentally walled in. That's how it survived. The perfect ghost from the past, waiting for someone like Megan to unearth it. By the time Rankin finished, tears streaked down his lined face. He said he carried the guilt for 14 years. Every promotion, every retirement party, every Christmas where he'd seen the Denton family's photo on the news, it had haunted him. "We didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. "But once you cross that line, there's no coming back." Megan recorded every word, her hands shaking. It wasn't just hearsay, it was a confession of a homicide and a cover-up. She knew this could finally expose the truth, but it also meant stepping into the same crosshairs that had taken Hal. Within 48 hours, she filed an internal request to reopen the case and attached her findings: the belt photos, the lab report, the audio from Rankin's confession. The response came swiftly and predictably: denial. Insufficient cause, the memo read. Within days, her apartment door lock was scratched open, her car window smashed, and an anonymous note appeared under her wiper: "Stop digging, or you'll end up like him." That was the moment Megan realized this wasn't about closure, it was survival. So she did what Hal Denton hadn't had the chance to do. She made copies. Digital, physical, and off-site. Every file, every photo, every recording. She mailed them to multiple addresses: the state attorney's office, a regional news outlet, and a private attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection. Then she walked into her captain's office and handed over her resignation. She didn't explain why. She just left her badge on the desk, said, "You'll find out soon enough," and walked out. Within a week, the story broke. Local news outlets led with the headline: "Missing Officer Case Reopened After 14 Years. New Evidence Points to Police Involvement." It spread like wildfire. Former officers were questioned, old files were subpoenaed, and the Illinois State Police announced a full-scale audit of the department. The public outcry was immediate. The Denton family finally got a chance to speak. Margaret stood in front of cameras trembling, clutching Hal's old service photo, saying she'd known all along something wasn't right. Behind the scenes, the walls started to crumble. One by one, those involved in the 1991 cover-up were questioned. Thomas Reddick lawyered up immediately. Caro, now the deputy chief, issued a statement denying all allegations, calling the claims a distortion of history. But when investigators pressed deeper, they uncovered financial records, unexplained cash deposits, and falsified overtime sheets from the same officers tied to the evidence room. Then, just as the state prepared to issue warrants, a tip came in, an anonymous call from a number traced to Rankin's town. It led investigators to a neglected patch of land behind a retired officer's property, just a mile from the old precinct. The caller claimed something had been buried there decades earlier during a department cleanup. Cadaver dogs were brought in. On the second day of the search, they alerted near a patch of overgrown grass beside an old foundation wall. The ground was soft beneath the shovel. When the forensic team began digging, they found fragments of uniform fabric, navy blue, with rusted brass buttons. Then a weathered leather holster. And beneath that, the remains of a man still wearing his badge. The discovery broke the town in half. For years, Hal Denton had been a ghost story, a man who simply vanished into thin air. Now his grave had been found just a few hundred yards from where he once worked, buried not by strangers, but by his own brothers in blue. When Megan got the call confirming the find, she didn't speak. She just sat in her kitchen, listening to the rain against the window, the sound distant and hollow. She'd known from the moment she saw that belt what she was chasing. But knowing and seeing are different things. The image of that cracked leather, the faint trace of blood, the sealed wall, all of it had led here. The official reports would later list the cause of death as blunt force trauma. The case was reclassified as homicide. Several retired officers faced charges of obstruction and tampering with evidence. Captain Caro resigned within days, citing health reasons, and vanished from public view. But for Megan, the real story wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the silence that followed. 14 years of secrets had been unearthed, but the cost was permanent. Reputations destroyed, lives appended, a family's grief confirmed rather than healed. She visited Hal's gravesite once after the case closed. She placed the recovered belt beside his headstone and stood there for a long time, unsure if justice had truly been served. Because in the end, she realized the most haunting truth of all: Hal Denton had died trying to protect the badge, and the badge had been the thing that killed him. And as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath that town was still hiding more than just one body. Megan couldn't sleep that night. The retired detective's confession, trembling, half-whispered, drenched in regret, played over in her head like a broken reel. Every detail matched the inconsistencies she'd noticed in the 1991 case file. The missing time logs, the doctored inventory sheets, the locker room being sealed just weeks later under the pretense of mold contamination. Now, it wasn't just a theory, it was a cover-up. One that had lived behind the badges for over a decade. She knew this wasn't just negligence. It was murder, and it was orchestrated by the very people sworn to protect the truth. The next morning, Megan drove out to the detective's small house on the edge of town, the man who'd broken the silence after years of guilt. His name was Richard Delaney. His hands trembled as he poured coffee into two chipped mugs, the steam rising between them like a fragile truce. He told her he'd been a rookie then, younger than she was now. Hal Denton, he said, was different. He didn't play politics, didn't look away when something didn't add up. And that, more than anything, had sealed his fate. According to Delaney, the night Hal disappeared, there was a fight in the locker room. Not a shouting match, but something raw and physical. Denton had confronted Sergeant Blake Hensley about falsified narcotics reports. Hensley had been skimming confiscated drugs, passing them off to a local informant network that quietly tied back to the department's own funding pool. Denton had found out, and he wasn't going to let it slide. Delaney's voice faltered when he described what happened next. Denton had shoved Hensley against a locker, demanding to know why evidence bags were missing. A few other officers rushed in, trying to separate them. But someone swung, maybe Hensley, maybe not, and Denton's head struck the edge of a metal bench. The sound, Delaney said, never left his mind. The room went silent. Denton didn't move. Someone checked his pulse, and in that moment of panic, they decided he was dead. They dragged him toward the utility hall. Delaney had stood frozen, terrified, as the men he looked up to began erasing a life. He paused, eyes wet, and told Megan something that sent a chill down her spine, that after Denton's body was gone, the sergeant ordered everyone to scrub the floors and burn the towels. They dumped what they could in construction debris behind the precinct. Then the renovation began, sealing off the locker room forever. They said it was mold, Delaney whispered. But it was him. That whole room was a tomb. Megan sat in silence. The old detective's confession was heavy, but it was also dangerous. He told her names, men still alive, some now retired, others quietly working desk jobs in nearby counties. The cover-up hadn't ended. It had simply changed hands. She recorded their conversation with his permission, knowing this might be the last honest thing he ever said. Before she left, he pressed something into her palm, a rusted locker key, engraved faintly with a number 42. They bricked the lockers, he said, but not all of them. That night, Megan returned to the old precinct basement with a flashlight and her phone camera running. The air was thick with dust, the walls chipped and discolored from years of neglect. She counted down the rows until she reached where locker 42 would have been. The bricks looked uneven, patched in a hurry. Using a crowbar, she chipped away until metal glinted through the plaster. Inside was an empty space barely large enough for a small duffel bag. The edges were stained dark, not paint, not rust. She reached in and found a small metal tag wedged in the corner, the kind once attached to police equipment. The engraving read, "Property of H. Denton." Her chest tightened. It was confirmation, physical proof that Denton's belongings were hidden intentionally. She photographed everything, bagged the tag, and took it straight to her car. She didn't drive home. Instead, she went straight to the state crime lab, bypassing local law enforcement entirely. Within 48 hours, she received a discreet call from a state investigator who confirmed what she already feared. The residue on the tag contained traces of cleaning solvent and human blood proteins. It was evidence of a cleanup, not an accident. Then the threats began. Anonymous voicemails. A car idling too long across from her apartment. Her inbox flooded with blank emails. Someone even slipped a note under her windshield that read, "Let it die, or you will too." Megan knew what it meant. Someone inside the department was watching her. She'd crossed the line from curiosity to danger. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. She made encrypted copies of all her files, every recording, photo, and forensic report, and mailed them to multiple addresses, including one to the state attorney's office, another to a journalist she trusted. When she resigned from the force, she didn't do it quietly. Her exit interview turned into a confrontation. Her superior officers denied every allegation, insisting she was spreading rumors and endangering the department's reputation. But Megan left with one final statement. Your silence buried him once. It won't happen again. She turned in her badge and walked out, leaving behind the same building where a man had vanished 14 years earlier. Within a week, the story leaked. Local news picked it up first. Police belt linked to missing Inspector Sparks' internal investigation. By the next day, national media descended on the small town. Reporters swarmed the precinct, demanding answers about Hal Denton's disappearance and the alleged locker room cover-up. The chief issued a statement denying all accusations, but his voice cracked under the pressure. The state opened a full audit of the department's records, and several officers were placed on leave. Delaney's testimony became the cornerstone of the investigation. He named 4 men who were in the building that night: Hensley, 2 other sergeants, and a patrolman who'd since retired to a remote property outside town. When investigators searched that property, they discovered something that confirmed everything Megan had fought for. Behind the barn, overgrown with weeds and brush, was a patch of disturbed soil marked by fragments of concrete and rusted nails, remnants of old construction material. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the dirt. The following morning, cadaver dogs were brought in. Within minutes, they alerted in the same spot. As excavators began to dig, a haunting quiet settled over the field. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell of decay became, faint but undeniable. Then, a fragment of a police badge emerged from the soil, its numbers barely visible but unmistakable. It matched Hal Denton's badge number. When the remains were finally exhumed, DNA testing confirmed the truth. After 14 years, Inspector Hal Denton had been found. His body was wrapped in old construction tarp, consistent with the renovation timeline of the precinct's locker room. The final forensic report showed trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force impact, the kind that might occur from striking a metal bench. The coroner's conclusion was chillingly simple: homicide. The news rippled through the community. Retired officers were arrested. 2 confessed in plea deals, while 1 maintained his innocence until the end. Hensley, the man at the center of it all, was found dead from an apparent overdose before he could be brought to trial. For Megan, the discovery was bittersweet. She'd lost her career, her safety, and her peace, but she'd given Denton something he'd been denied for years: the truth. Standing at the field where his remains were found, she watched as the coroner's van pulled away. The air was still, heavy with the weight of justice long delayed. In the silence, she could almost hear his voice, calm, steady, determined, reminding her that truth doesn't die in the dark. It just waits for someone brave enough to dig it up. When the excavation began, the town fell silent. The once-forgotten field, a stretch of overgrown land behind a retired officer's property, was suddenly filled with forensic tents, floodlights, and the low hum of machinery. It had been 2 weeks since the state investigators took over, and every hour felt heavier than the last. Beneath the cracked concrete slab at the center of the property, ground-penetrating radar had shown something irregular, something shaped like a human outline. Officers stood back as forensic crews began to dig layer by layer, the air thick with anticipation and dread. What lay beneath would either confirm the worst fears of an entire community or reopen wounds many believed had healed years ago. By midday, the digging reached a depth of 4 feet. The soil was dense, packed with debris, nails, wood, broken concrete, and traces of old construction material that matched the precinct's renovation timeline from 1991. Then a sharp cry broke the quiet. A gloved hand brushed away dirt and revealed the curve of a bone, yellowed, fragile, unmistakably human. Investigators froze. The site lead radioed in for confirmation. Soon, a full skeletal structure began to emerge from the earth, partially wrapped in what looked like degraded construction tarp. On the chest, caked in mud, was a small piece of metal, a police badge fragment, worn smooth by years underground. The numbers were faint, but under the right light, they matched the badge number of Inspector Harold Denton. 14 years of rumors, speculation, and silence collapsed in that instant. Every theory, the runaway, the affair, the secret disappearance, all dissolved into the truth that had been buried just a few miles from the station where he once worked. The remains were carefully exhumed, bones placed one by one into labeled evidence containers. When the coroner's team lifted the skull, a fracture was visible across the back, consistent with blunt force trauma. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle beyond that fatal blow. Whoever had done this hadn't meant to scare him, they meant to silence him. DNA testing took days, but few doubted the result. When the lab confirmed the identity, The official report was delivered to the state attorney's office. Human remains recovered from the Denton Field site are a positive match for Inspector Harold Denton. The announcement hit the department like a thunderclap. Some officers cried openly, others simply turned away. For the first time, the town saw the truth in black and white, that their missing inspector hadn't walked away from his post. He had been killed for doing his job. The story spread fast. News outlets replayed images of the excavation site on loop. Old photos of Hal appeared on every screen, a tall man with tired eyes and a calm expression, his uniform pressed sharp, his nameplate glinting under the flash of old cameras. His family, long estranged from the department, returned to town for the identification process. His widow, Margaret Denton, stood beside the forensic van as the casket was loaded. She'd aged beyond recognition, years of uncertainty having etched deep lines into her face. When asked for a statement, she simply said, "He told me he wouldn't stop until he cleaned up that place. I guess he didn't." Inside the precinct, the mood was suffocating. The walls that had once echoed with chatter now felt sterile, hollow. Internal affairs moved in again, this time not quietly. Every file, every logbook from 1991 was reopened. Desks were emptied. Lockers were searched. One by one, the old guard began to fall. The officers who had stayed silent were forced to testify. Some cooperated. Others pleaded the fifth. Sergeant Blake Hensley's suicide note surfaced days later, confirming his role in the cover-up. It detailed the fight, the panic, and the moment they realized they'd gone too far. He wrote that Denton had to be stopped, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. For Megan Halloran, the discovery was both vindication and burden. She had uncovered what no one else dared to touch, but in doing so, she had exposed a wound so deep it could never truly heal. Her name appeared in headlines, but she avoided interviews. Instead, she spent her time helping the Denton family coordinate the burial, quietly watching from the sidelines as they lowered the casket into the ground. The department sent a wreath, but no uniformed officer attended the funeral. It was as if the institution itself couldn't face what it had done. In the days that followed, an independent commission reviewed every case Denton had been investigating before his death. Several of them involved narcotics, missing evidence, and internal misconduct, threads that now pointed directly to the same officers implicated in the cover-up. The scale of corruption shocked even veteran investigators. What had started as one man's disappearance now revealed a network of falsified reports, stolen property, and decades of deceit. The state shut down the old precinct for renovations, stripping its basement bare. When construction crews returned to the site that year, workers said the air in the basement felt unnaturally cold. Even after the heating was restored, the temperature near the old locker room remained lower than the rest of the building. Electricians double-checked the wiring, but found nothing wrong. Some swore they heard faint sounds late at night, the metallic clink of a belt buckle, the creak of a locker door that no longer existed. Most dismissed it as imagination, but a few believed the building remembered. The town tried to move on, but the story never left. Every new recruit learned about Inspector Denton, not from official training, but from whispers in the hallways. His name became a warning, a quiet reminder that silence can destroy more than words ever could. A plaque was eventually placed in the main lobby, engraved with his name and the phrase, "He didn't vanish, he was erased." It wasn't sanctioned by the department, but no one dared remove it. Megan left the force for good, relocating to a neighboring city. Occasionally, she would receive calls from journalists asking her to recount the story, but she always refused. She didn't want fame, she wanted peace. Yet at night, when she thought about everything that had unfolded, she realized peace might never come. She still carried the rusted locker key, number 42, on her keychain. A reminder of the night she opened the wall and found the past waiting inside. 14 years of unanswered questions had ended not with a confession, but with a discovery buried beneath dirt and concrete. The truth wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, messy, human. It was a handful of men making a choice they couldn't undo, and a single officer refusing to forget. The Denton case became one of the most haunting examples of internal corruption in the state's history, studied in training academies as a lesson in accountability. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't about policy. It was about a man who stood alone against a tide of silence and paid the price for it. Years later, when new recruits walked through the freshly painted halls of the precinct, few knew the full story. They saw the polished floors, the new lockers, the badge insignia shining bright on the walls. But some nights, when the wind howled through the vents and the building groaned with age, a faint chill would roll through the lower level, cold enough to make even the seasoned officers glance over their shoulders. They said it was nothing, just old air ducts, bad insulation. But those who knew better, those who had seen what the building was capable of hiding, would quietly disagree. Because some places don't forget. Some walls remember. And in the silence of that basement, where truth was buried and unearthed again, the presence of Inspector Hal Denton still lingered, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that justice, no matter how long it takes, eventually claws its way back to the surface.